here, the Lovettsville Historical Society, we're rather mindful that we exist as a society and as a museum because of the last great American Revolution independence celebration of the 1970s. And thereby to confront it again as it creeps up, and many of you were there at that time, probably have a mix of memories of those 1970s events. But today we'll deal with two things. Our first notion is to consider whether or not we have new ideas of why there's an American Revolution. Let's just read, and I think what we're going to see over the next 6 or 7 years is almost all of us will tend to pick up a tome on independence and the American Revolution and the like, even if we haven't been reading in that particular area. We might be inclined to. Some of you do it naturally because you're interested in them. But we hope between our panelists, I'll introduce the comment, and you, that we can get some thinking about why that revolution came on. We'll be taking a break after that. That will be our more difficult question to play with, and our probably more historical question. The second one is a sort of a today question. How should we commemorate this time around? If you remember how we did the last time, if you remember what we've done for other commemorations, I mean, this is the commemoration state, my friends. We led the Civil War sesquicentennial. We led the 400th. James, the 1619 commemoration. We led the World War I centennial. It's like, if you're involved in history at all, it's like, what, are we commemorating something? But this is a biggie. At 250, it's a biggie. And we'll be talking about what we ought to do. To begin with, this, you'll notice, had a slide up there for quite a while that spoke of the Virginia 250. And there is a Loudoun County Virginia 250 committee. As a matter of fact, the General Assembly has more or less ordered or strongly recommended that every jurisdiction, city and county of the Commonwealth, establish such a committee. It has some 99 committees. There is state funding for the statewide committee, and they help the local committees, but the local committees in turn help the statewide committees so that we have an intelligent commemoration. This is an official program of the Loudoun County Virginia 250. We began our first programming in March of 2023. We've had a number of programs since. And if you Google Loudoun County Virginia 250, you will be able to find the kinds of programs that we're doing. Lovettsville Historical Society here was a quick participant in the county committee. The county committee was primarily made up of representatives from certain jurisdictions, largely from historic sites, historic organizations, preservation organizations, Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution. If you are involved in history in any way or belong to any of Loudoun's historic sites, or there are many organizations that support them, you probably have representatives from your organization that attend those monthly meetings that we've been doing now for the better part of 2 years. So it's an exciting thing for the Lovettsville Historical Society to take this on. Our question, of course, in the back of our minds has to be, how interested are people in this? It is a controversial time. Today is a controversial day. If you think about it, here we are on Bastille Day, considering the American Revolution that happened a quarter of a century earlier. I think it is an exciting moment, though, for us to play with what we're going to. If we can advance slides, I guess we need to do 2 to get to where we want to go to. If we can get this to advance.
Well, just keep talking, I'll try and get it.
Well, I'm going to start with just this. An event that you probably don't know about. But to me, it was important enough that I wanted to illustrate it. And it's, yeah, there we go. We can make that big, then we're golden. And we don't want everyone seeing what you see.
No, I know.
You don't need to see it. PowerPoints, aren't they fun? I learned to do PowerPoint when I was in my early 70s. I've been boycotting using those difficult technologies for years. I've shown digital slideshows since I was young, but whatever. Here we go. It is the 28th of April, 1775. It's Friday night in Leesburg. And there are people that have gathered at Loudoun's newest and most prosperous tavern on the main road into Leesburg, the county seat. At this point, county seat is just 13 years old. County is just 18 years old. But if you want to be seen or you want to see and find out what's going on, then Captain McCabe's Ordinary on Loudon Street, sometimes today known as the Patterson House, but at that time known as McCabe's Ordinary, the largest tavern in Leesburg, was where you wanted to go. It was also, when you came into the town limits proper, the first tavern that you came to. And there they are, talking, carousing, drinking, probably still talking about what had happened over the recent months with the unpleasantness with Mother Country. And a rider comes up, all of a lather from Alexandria, announcing a shocking thing. What has come to be known and still is listed on tombstones for those that responded to it as the Lexington Alarm. A massacre of Minutemen, of militiamen, just like Loudon has, on Lexington Green, 11 miles from Boston, by His Majesty's troops. Let's do an advance if we can. And at Lexington, this will set in motion a train of events on the 19th of April, 9 days earlier, that will lead to what we call the shot heard round the world. Fighting in Concord, fighting in Lincoln, Lexington, Arlington, then Menominee, Cambridge, Charlestown, all the way back to Boston. And now a siege of Boston going on by militia from Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts Bay. And that is how we learn, through that lathered messenger up from Alexandria, that we were in a revolution. And I guess the question would come rather naturally from them. Let's go to the next slide. How would we respond to that? A couple of things you should know. It had just been 5 weeks since the Second Virginia Convention had been convened extra legally, not allowed by the Crown, extra legally at St. John's Church on Churchill in Richmond, not then our capital. Williamsburg was still the capital. And it was there that Patrick Henry had made the former member of the House of Delegates, made the following proposal. He put forth to the body, resolved that this colony be immediately put into a state of defense and that a committee be named by this convention to prepare a plan for embodying, arming, and disciplining such a number of men as may be sufficient for that purpose. We are forming an illegal army. Now that's interesting because in Massachusetts Bay, they'd done it 6 months earlier in October of 1774. But here's old conservative Virginia joining to do that. Since late November, early December, Loudoun County has had an illegal, or maybe I should say extra legal militia, an independent militia company, not allowed by the royal governor, not allowed by the Crown or Parliament, but they're meeting and drilling on the courthouse grounds. And now they realize that all they've been drilling for, all the counties and cities in Virginia have been preparing for, is in their lap. Let's go one more slide forward. Loudon itself had pledged its fealty to these kinds of efforts. On the 14th of June, 1774, the year before, we had gathered on the courthouse lawn in response to the closing of the Port of Boston and the dismemberment of the Massachusetts Bay provincial government that had existed since 1691, the year before the witch trials. And with that, we had made the following resolution, among others: resolved that the enforcing the execution of the said acts of Parliament closing Boston and dismembering their provincial government by a military power must have a necessary tendency to raise a civil war, and that we, Loudoners, freeholders in Loudon, will, by our lives and fortunes, assist and support our suffering brethren of Boston and every part of North America that may fall under the immediate hand of oppression until the redress of all of our grievances shall be procured and our common liberties established on a permanent foundation. We take backward steps. We see that Loudoners have been getting ready for that night when they're sitting at McCabe's Tavern and hear the news of Lexington and Concord. So to come to war, 14,000 Loudoners, most of them new, in a county that had burgeoned in population in 20 years to be one of Virginia's most populous. And so this is the question that we present to our panel today. They're going to start with brief opening statements of their thought in answer to the question that we would read roughly as what brought this revolution on. And we're talking about this on a number of levels, and our panelists will be all over the map on this, which is kind of a fun thing about it. So each of them will go 2 minutes, and then we'll simply turn this into a discussion between the panelists. You will be turned to, and hopefully your comments, observations, sharings of what you may know or have read, or even your questions can be a part of that discussion. And then once we're all pretty hot and exhausted, we'll take a break and go over to the air-conditioned community hall, and we have lots to munch on. Lots of libations, and it should be a good afternoon. So my panel, I'm going to sit down, turn things to you, and I'm going to ask if we can do that we start with Ian.
Well. Okay, well. So,
You can start showing me.
I'm Ian.
In which we need to know who Ian is. This panel is a group of my fellow associates. They are all members of the Latin 250 committee, and they come from a wide variety of backgrounds and organizations. From one right, this is Bill Logan, who is one of Latin's favorite teachers, a long-time career history teacher at Stonebridge High School, and he has been on the Heritage Commission for many years. He was the chair of Loudoun County's appointed Heritage Commission, has been a guy that falls bluff since many of us were in diapers, and he is one of those fellows who was the most likely person to turn out for a history program. This is your third program this weekend?
I guess it's a blur.
Yeah, there we go. Next, we have Alicia Cohen. Alicia Cohen is a key member, a real driver on the Black History Committee of the Balch Library of History and Genealogy, has been leading field trips exploring African American history in Loudoun County. And she is one who can give us perspectives that not everyone can. And she's also gleefully here, outspoken. So I'm looking forward. Ian McDougall is the public events coordinator for the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area that encompasses Loudoun, Fauquier, Prince William, Clark, and Warren counties, and a former employee of Colonial Williamsburg, playing of the Revolution. The only shock is that he didn't show up in royal uniform today of a Scot. Speak, if Alicia will confound us, Ian will confound us as well. You know, the Scots like to be ornery. Next, we have Travis Shaw. He also is with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, an archaeologist by trade, turned to become the education director for the Heritage Area for these past 8 years, 7 years. Someone who does a lot of programming in our schools about the American Revolution in Loudon. And then we have Nancy Spence. If you come here much, you see Nancy a lot. This is Ed's beloved wife and the author of 2 books that examine history through the lens of Alexander Hamilton. Most recent book examining the difficulty of trying to do away with slavery here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, particularly looked at through a bit of a federalist viewpoint. So I think with our 5 panelists, and occasionally I'll toss in an edgewise word, we should have a good discussion. So the question is, why the revolution? What brings it on? What do you think is involved?
Why the revolution? Thank you, Rich, and I'm glad you mentioned the honorary Scots, because I'm going to talk about one honorary Scot in particular, that is John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, last royal governor of Virginia. When I look at the cause of the revolution, I'm looking at it through the scope of Virginia, and when I'm looking at the actual causes of the start of the war, I'm looking at the events that take place from the end of 1773 over these next 2 tumultuous years, through 1774 and the spring 1775. So in December of 1775, we have, or excuse me, the December of 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party. And this is going to create reverberating events that are going to cascade across all 13 colonies. And here in Virginia, that's going to have some pretty drastic effects. As we decide what we want to do about what's happening in Boston, our House of Purposes, as Rich mentioned earlier, is going to vote to have a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support and solidarity with those men in Boston, those people in Boston. When the Boston Tea Party happens, the British respond by closing the port of Boston. Thousands of people are out of work. This is a port city. And if it could happen in Boston, it could happen in Virginia. And so when our House of Burgesses decides to hold that day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in support of those people in Boston, our governor, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, is going to respond rather rashly. Again, he's a very angry Scot, and he's not going to put up with any kind of rebellious activity. And he, in turn, gets rid of our House of Burgesses. And this is huge, because now, at this moment, we've been dealing with the issues of taxation without representation, Stamp Act, over this basically last decade, but now it's real, right? It's showing the Virginians that the British will take action against them. And the other big thing that this is going to do, and I don't want to run over my time, I'm going to get more into it in a minute, but the other thing that this does when the House of Burgesses dissolves, they're not able to enact the militia law. The militia law is renewed every several years, which keeps a civilian military force, essentially, an armed force of every free white man between the ages of 16 and 60, every free white non-Catholic man between the ages of 16 and 60, armed so that they can respond in a time of emergency when the governor should call upon them. And without that system in place, the counties take it upon themselves to arm their own men. And now that they're already angry about what Lord Dunmore's done and what the British government has done in Boston, we basically created this space for armed men to begin drilling and training in places like the Leesburg Courthouse. And that's only going to foment more and more rebellious sentiment, and it's going to create a lot of distrust between the governor and the people. So I feel like I've already gone on, but I'll go ahead and pass it on to our next panel.
All right, so I just asked to go second. I like to joke that the American Revolution is the most British thing possible. And what I mean by that is, first of all, we need to look at the revolution as a intertwined event with the American War of Independence, but a political revolution and the military war are related, but not necessarily the same. And to kind of explain that, I'd like to look back at the British political tradition that they have been cultivating for centuries. Is unlike anywhere else in the Western world. You look at Europe in the 1760s and the 1770s, you have an absolutist monarchy in France, you have an absolutist monarchy in Prussia, in Russia, in Spain. Britain is the only major world power with a parliamentary system. And that goes back, we can take it all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, directly take it back to the events of the English Civil War and the conflict over where the power of a king ends and the power of the people begins. We look at the philosophers that our founding fathers are reading, these ideas of social contracts. When the political revolution starts, we look at the imperial crisis of the 1760s, people aren't advocating for independence in 1765. People are not advocating for a republic in 1765. They're advocating for their rights as Englishmen. They see themselves as the freest people in the world compared to those Catholics on the continent or wherever. They see themselves as part of this incredible empire that offers all of these opportunities. And what they want is a share in that empire. They want the rights that were promised to them. Where the actual, when you think about this, it's kind of a backwards looking movement, kind of a very conservative movement. They're trying to reclaim what they think they once had. The real revolution politically is what happens during the War of Independence and after the events that Ian's talking about and Rich is talking about, where now we do have calls for independence. We have calls for republic. We have calls for expanded suffrage and a government in which everyone, or at least, every free white man has a voice. That is the true revolution for me. The true political revolution is in a few short years, like you said, from 1763 to 1776, a switch is flipped, where all of a sudden we go from wanting to reclaim our rights as Englishmen to founding in something that is radically progressive for its era. So I don't think we have that without that political tradition. It's one reason Rich, you mentioned the French Revolution. One reason the French Revolution is so very different from the American Revolution is there is no tradition in which kings have a check on their power. There is no tradition where, you have a parliament that exercises power, any sort of suffrage whatsoever.
So I'm thinking about this, but I'm thinking of more than one revolution. Because typically the revolution is talked about based on colonialists who were white British people. But there were other people living here at the same time. Some who were forcibly brought here and sold throughout all the colonies. And then there were Native Americans who were displaced. So they're hearing this. They may not have been a part of that dialogue, but they're hearing it. Where are they hearing it? If they're cooks, they're hearing it in the homes. Their owners are talking about. If they are working in these taverns or ordinaries, they're hearing it all day. And so they're trying to decide, well, where do I fit in this? Some of the colonists are saying that they feel like they're slaves to the crown. But I'm a slave. And so am I a part of this freedom? Well, I can't speak to Native Americans because I haven't really studied them as they relate to the Revolutionary War. But I can take you back to 1770 during the Boston Massacre, when Crispus Attucks, who was a sailor on the docks there in the Boston, he was a sailor, but this happened outside of Boston. But he felt like, I'm a free person and I'm vested in freedom too. So therefore, he was part of the Boston Massacre, said to be one of the first to die for this potentially new republic. He didn't know what was going to happen. He became a hero. And my own personal interest peaked when I worked in Boston in the 70s. that long ago, where there's signs and things because he became a hero. Flashback up and down the coast, persons who were of African descent, both free and enslaved, were having conversations about how does this affect me? And should I get involved? Not everybody got involved, but many people did, many men did, and many women followed their men throughout the Revolutionary War. So there were women involved, and there were women who were cooks. But for them, it was a second revolution. And however, it was still based on freedom.
It's on, go ahead.
Hello? Okay, there we go. Okay, I guess so. Well, I really agree with Travis on the difference between the revolution and the war. In fact, there was a speech given on the eve of the Constitutional Convention by Benjamin Rush, making precisely that point, and John Adams was jumping up and down saying it all the time. This is a revolution in thinking, right? It's a revolution in thinking. So I want to address the thinking as in the Declaration of Independence, because if you want to talk about the causes of the revolution, that was to be our official statement of the causes of the revolution. So I think we have to start there. I think we have to pay attention to it and look at it very seriously. And of course, that document has become a matter of contention once again. It's been contentious all the way through. It was at the center of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's at the center of the debates that we have today, because I was a little bit pressed toward talking about latest scholarship, with Rich was initially asking about that. And the way I was thinking of latest scholarship was, well, really, it's the latest brawl between those who think that the Declaration of Independence was a principled statement of intent to be, like Lincoln said, to be there as a constant moral guide toward which we should move as soon as that we are capable, or whether it was, as Alexander Stevens said famously, that the founders at the time thought that that they were serious about this. They thought they were doing a bad thing with slavery, but they had to do it, right? But they were wrong, because we in the Confederacy know that we're finally establishing a government based on the real truth that there's an inferior race. So there's been that fight, and I think that fight, there's a lot of predicates to it, but it's one that we have to be discussing today.
Thank you, everybody. We on? Hello, test 1, 2. All right. Thank you, Richard, for that fine introduction. One of the burdens I have is that I'm actually trained in history. I have an MA from Notre Dame. Those of us who actually have training in history, I think, need to be held to a higher standard than those people who watch YouTube videos or enjoy a good podcast. And we have 3 challenges, Richard, that I think we're facing when we talk about the causes of the American Revolution. Number 1, I find very, very few teachers of American history, and now we have amateur writers about American history, have no real concept of something that goes back to what our friend Travis said. They have no real concept of the colonial charters and the struggle of the colonial legislatures to achieve a modicum of independence from first the trading companies that originally chartered some of the early colonies, the proprietors, William Penn, Oglethorpe, that crowd, who also were granted colonies, and third, the royal governors of the royal colonies. So I think one of the weaknesses as we go forward with our renewed interest on this anniversary of the revolution is a weak colonial understanding of those realities, which paves the way for my support of what Travis had said. Secondly, we've got current writings that also throw under the bus the various principles, as Nancy said, the various principles. Number one, going back, I'm just going to point out two of the culprits. We're only in the lane of the American Revolution. So we have a whole generation of young teachers who have grown up reading Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. What other values there may be in his book, again, that's outside of our lane today. But keep in mind that in one of the learned summaries of Howard Zinn says that the revolution was artificial, it was managed by the colonial aristocracy, it was an act of theft, and much of the political ideology and rhetoric were mere propaganda. So there will be a drumbeat during our commemoration of this revolution and our declaration that says it's all bunk. All right, so thank you, Howard Zinn. All right, the second thing, marvelous step forward in the New York Times. A nice article grew into a book, The 1619 Project. Tremendous resource of literature, poetry, through the entire saga of the African-American struggle. However, the fly in the oatmeal, or buttermilk, or wherever you want to have your disappointment, the disappointment is again on the cause of the American Revolution. And in the first New York Times Magazine article, there was a retreat done when the book edition came out, but a lot of fuss was made over a 1772 law case, the Court of King's Bench. It was a habeas corpus action involving a freedom-seeking Black man who was a slave named James Somerset. And in the case of Somerset versus Stewart, his owner, I guess would be the phrase we would say, whatever, I don't know. I always find that uncomfortable. Charles Stewart. But the court under Chief Justice Lord Mansfield said that habeas corpus would be granted to Somerset, that he would not be allowed to be taken back to the colonies. In fact, Mr. Stewart was so angry with Somerset, he wanted to sell him to Jamaica as sort of a punishment. And the court said an escaping slave could not be forcibly removed from England for retributive punishment in a colony. Now that's 1772. It doesn't abolish slavery in the colonies, but the comment that's made first in the 1619 article and persists in the book is that somehow or another a lot of the cause of the American Revolution was American colonists fearing that slavery was being brought to an end legally in the British Empire, and therefore the authors said that this is a major cause of the revolution. Now, those of us who studied the revolution know that if that was the case, then there wouldn't have been Tories down south, and the Tory region of the revolution was down south. But those are the three problems I think we're going to be bumping into when we try to carry on learned conversations about the causes of the American Revolution. Limited knowledge of the colonial past, Howard Zinn, and the 1619 Project in that one particular area. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you all for our opening shots across the bow. For years, there is a quote that rattles around and appears in any number of textbooks, books on the American Revolution, or books on American culture. A Minuteman turned Continental soldier by the name of Prescott was asked in 1854, and he was at least as old as most of us, as he thought back, what did he think the cause of the American Revolution was? And he was a plain spoken farmer, and he said, we always meant to rule ourselves. they didn't mean we should. And I would throw that out there. To complicate matters, I would like to just mention that if we're talking about the German settlement here and Loudoun County, that we have large numbers of people here who have come with different religions from the established Church of England, that they have come from areas other than England, some of them, Scotland, Ireland, particularly the German states. And we would also note that many of them here do not own land. They lease it, rent it, sometimes work for somebody else. And yet I go back to Soldier Prescott's comment. We always meant to rule ourselves. They didn't mean we should. And along with complications otherwise, I toss that out to say, was this a revolution only with Parliament in the sights? Or were there mixed motives here due to the different religions, ethnic groups, landholding status, and the like? And is that they? Who might we be talking about? Just Parliament? Or what? Anybody want to try to wrestle with that?
That's a great question, and really dovetails nicely into what you mentioned earlier about kind of the more recent scholarship. Some of the best scholarship in the last few decades about the Revolutionary War is tackling this exact question. What exactly is the role of the common man? And I'm thinking of like Woody Holton. I'm thinking of Gary Nash, Urban Crucible. You have these pockets of people where people are mixing. The Port of Boston, the city of Philadelphia, where you have this melting pot of cultures and religions and languages and ideas all coming together. And it's really no accident that those places become kind of the powder kegs of the revolutionary movement. And I think there's a certain sense that, we have these elites who are directing a lot of the revolutionary politics. Here in Virginia, we have our Patrick Henrys and our Washingtons and our Jeffersons and so forth. But they can't accomplish what they are trying to do without the buy-in of the average person. The Continental Army is not going to survive in the field if nobody believes enough to join that cause. And there's, I think, a certain sense that amongst these elites, it's like holding back a flood. You stand there and you hold the dam until it bursts, and then you have mob rule, you have anarchy, you have, one of the most terrifying words to someone in the 18th century is democracy. Or do you channel the flow? Do you harness that revolutionary fervor? Do you give them just enough that they can sustain this cause without completely overturning the entire social system? And I think that speaks a lot to, I'm sure, what Nancy has a lot of opinions about, the struggle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and the struggles between those who, want to ratify our Constitution versus those who did not want to ratify this Constitution. Again, these questions of where does the power of the people begin and end?
Well, I'll just throw in, being the official naysayer to that. Oh, very good. Thank you, everybody. Hello, everybody out there on video. But the danger I find is that 2024 is something we have to be very careful of. We've gone through one pandemic. I think during the commemoration of the revolution, we're going to have to watch out for looking at things. There was no real proletarian base back then. So we're talking about individuals that might have been, like, I was thinking when you were saying about the Catholics in Maryland. You know, we have Patrick Henry, one of the great lawyers for the Baptists who were oppressed by the Church of England. So I think those individual motivations, whether it rises to a decisive cause of the American Revolution, I'm not willing to walk that far out on the porch. Okay, so that's just where I am. Okay, God help me, amen.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about, again, what happens in 1774 and 75. You've had these colonial leaders, at least here in Virginia, fighting the good fight against taxation without representation. You've got like non-importation happening, but you don't have that much engagement with the common people here. Now, it's very different in Boston, right? It's a very different place in Boston. The class structure is very different in Boston than it is here. But for me, there's this moment in 1775 that just flips this switch in a lot of the common people's heads in Virginia, where they start to see an active conspiracy against them, or what they perceive to be a conspiracy against them. When the Port of Boston is closed and when the House of Burgesses is essentially dissolved by the governor, that's one thing, right? They aren't probably going to be fans of that, but when in April of 1775, news from basically all over the country is coming in all at once, and the propaganda machine, the newspapers are at full tilt, you see big changes. What I'm referring to here is in April of 1775, when the royal governor, again, Lord Dunmore, when he removes the gunpowder from the public magazine, he's responding to an order that was issued, a circular letter by Lord Dartmouth, who's the Secretary of State for the colonies. And Lord Dartmouth, worried about everything that's happening, again, mostly in Boston, but in other places as well, he orders the royal governors to remove the public powder, their gunpowder, from their stores and to stop the importation of gunpowder into the colonies. So imagine that from a common person's perspective. Wow, this is no longer heady political notions and issues between the king and parliament and the country. This is now actually affecting my future security. This is affecting my life here. Especially if you're somebody living in Western Virginia, people who are trying to move into places along into the Appalachians, and you're dealing with Native American attacks and so forth. So a lot of people in Virginia are going to be really, really upset about this. And when exactly. Virginia is a slave colony, and a lot of people are worried around that time of slave rebellions. And so for a lot of the white Virginians, this is going to be the last nail in the coffin. And that news is coming in everywhere, right? The gunpowder is removed from the public magazine in Williamsburg on April 20th to 21st, 1775. What happens just a day before that in Massachusetts? The battles of Lexington and Concord over a very similar issue. The British are going to arrest gunpowder there in Concord. The day after, April 22nd, I believe, in Charleston, South Carolina, people are breaking into the public stores and taking gunpowder all at once. So 48 hours, essentially, amidst 13 colonies, you're seeing everything start to unfold. And this, again, starts to look like a grand conspiracy against the people. And so that's going to turn people who might not have been involved into armed individuals ready, essentially, to fight.
Okay. I think this is a good time to mention this book, Our Revolution, Our Declaration, excuse me. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it is a book from 2013 by an African-American scholar at Harvard who discusses a non-libertarian view of the American Declaration of Independence. And one of the major points she makes up front, which I found very compelling, was, and I've got one example from Virginia to make that more concrete, is how much the so-called ordinary people, or at least the white males, were involved in the decisions that were made in the centers of power. She has a whole list of how many meetings, how many petitions, how many discussions had to happen. And take Virginia, and this happened in other ways in other colonies. Prior to the Declaration, The reason the declaration was not voted on until early July, when the vote for it was several weeks before that, was because the group the illegal whatever, House of Delegates said, we have to go out and find out what people think about this. We have to have meetings all around the Commonwealth to discuss what we should do. And 31 counties around Virginia came up with resolves as to what Virginia should do in response to Boston and what Dunmore had done to shut it down. So, you know, it's not advertised. It's not always easy to find how much the so-called, you know, ordinary people were involved in the discussion, but it happened. It happened.
Or something more out here. I'll try to throw something more at it. One thing that strikes me, we were doing a series of field trips as part of our German Settlement 2 class that we offer every spring. And we opened with Ed Spanis and Mike Zapp and others teaching a session on the German settlement of the American Revolution. And one of the first things that struck me was, I think it was Ed who was pointing out, there was no Lovettsville. Indeed, the closest village to us was Waterford. And beyond that, it was the brand new county seat of Leesburg. And beyond that, it was Georgetown or Fredericktown to the north, or the new city of Alexandria. And that struck me this way. How on earth do you make public opinion if you've got people that spread out, that rural, who don't necessarily speak the same language or share a common culture? How do you form public opinion? You and I have all watched public opinion form on two things. And we'll bring this to a presentism here. What's the shape of President Joe Biden? And what's going to happen because of what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania last night? We'll watch public opinion crystallize and be formed, partly naturally, partly manipulated by various voices. Let's go back to 1773, 4, 5 and ask, in this very rural spread out area, how do we do that? Most of our soldiers in the Continental Army did not come from Boston or New York or Philadelphia, where you could form public opinion. It came from all over, from towns, a few cities, villages, and mostly from rural areas. How was that consensus formed? So let me turn that back to our panel for any observations you might have.
I mean, I think some of that consensus happens in buildings exactly like the one we're in right now. I mean, religious communities are especially important for many of these rural populations, especially many of these immigrant populations. I mean, the power of the Reformed Church within the German community, the Baptist Church, and the Presbyterian Church within the Scots community. So I think religion has a huge role to play in that, especially those religions that have been, you know, essentially subjugated to the Anglican Church here in the colonies, the official church of the colonies. I think another big part of this, and this may seem a little off the wall, but one of my favorite books about the coming of the revolution is the book Marketplace of Revolution by T.H. Breen. And he's very into material culture. I'm very into material culture. He discusses this marketplace revolution that happens in the 18th century. You know, for the first time in global history, anyone from Falmouth, Maine to Savannah, Georgia to the Forks of the Ohio can have their kitchen full of Indian tea, West Indian sugar, wools from England, cotton printed fabrics from India. And this is true. You can look at a probate inventory for someone living on the furthest extent of the frontier. They might not have furniture to sleep on, but they may have a set of China coffee cups. They may have sugar in their pantry. And he goes into very great detail about this, backing up with historic resources. What that helps to do is form a kind of unifying culture. No matter where you are, where you're black, white, German, Dutch, Spanish, you're here in the colonies, you're consuming the same goods, you're buying the same goods, you're tied into the same global network. What's one of the first things we do to express our resistance to British tyranny? We stop buying that stuff. We use that economic voice that we have as a way of resisting and of showing our displeasure. One of the first things that's listed in the Loudon Resolves is we're not going to import any more goods from Britain. We're not going to sell any more Loudon goods to Britain. And I think that actually, I find it a fairly convincing argument, because no matter where you are in the colonies, you're tied into this world of goods. We like to think of the colonies as, people making a living by their bare hands, producing everything that they use in their homes. By the 1770s, that's not really the case. These goods are freely available, they're widely available, and they're fairly affordable. To this day, we tend to buy above our station in life and above our means. I think it's a fairly convincing argument that it gives us all a shared kind of common language that we can use that plays into the early resistance against Britain. So I don't know if you buy it, but it's worth checking out.
One of the things too is we don't need to get much, in fact, the word consensus might be more than we really are dealing with in 1774, 75. People tend to ricochet from event to event to event, and they get in this deeper and deeper and deeper, or not at all. One of the cool guys in our revolutionary story, what is his name? John Dickinson, the man who starts out as a real strong advocate for the rights, the traditional rights, and then by the time the parade moves down the street, Dickinson sort of starts to back away. And I think we know the ending of our story, of the story, at least this phase of our story. American story hasn't ended, God help us. But they didn't know that, and they're responding to events, and some drop out along the way, and some slide in and out of the loyalist community. Some neutralize themselves at times. So I don't think we need to be searching for that much, And of course, there is no there are a few loyalists everywhere. There are a few patriots everywhere. There are a few other people that think that everybody's going crazy. It sounds like that.
Just to add to that, the idea of churches as commonplace to get all this information is really good. Another add-on to that is newspapers. The media, the propaganda machine, like I said earlier, is at full tilt at this period. I mean, you've got the Virginia Gazette, Dixon and Hunter, in the spring of 1775, essentially telling everyone that Lord Dunmore is a villain, and the things that he's doing are causing the ruination of our society. And those newspapers can be circulated throughout the entire colony. Now, one thing I would like to know more, and Travis could probably have the answer to this. German translations for communities in Western Virginia. Frederick has a German printed newspaper, so there are translations happening here, getting that news to everyone, regardless of language. So it is spreading around like wildfire. There's a period after Lexington and Concord, I think it's after Lexington and Concord, that the people think that the city of Boston has been brought to ash because it's being printed in a newspaper. Okay, so that it's so powerful at this time when you don't have many other venues or ways to get that information. Whoever's controlling the words that are getting out to people are able to sell that narrative. They'll sell the story of revolution.
Is it working? Okay. I just want to say this does include the African American and enslaved community, because it's not, there were church gatherings of those communities. There were, some itinerant preachers, some very significant. Whitefield, he turned at the end, someone gave him a plantation in Georgia and he ended up accepting it. But prior to that, he was out there agitating against slavery as an evil. And what happened all around the colonies is that when, in Massachusetts in particular, but these people would get, these ministers would give these speeches, fiery speeches for the equating, liberation for from Great Britain with the rights that they are due under God. And they would be printed as a pamphlet. They would be circulated. There would be hundreds of them going from one end of the country to the other. People were reading, right? This is one of getting into the second part of it. What do we recommend for this celebration coming up? People should read. Forget it. Forget the idea of 5-minute videos, they have to read or we're not going to have a republic.
Want to point this out, that if you go to the very first monument erected to the American Revolution, it was erected just before the 25th anniversary, 1799. On it is a plaque which uses a very famous phrase, "They nobly dared to be free." And there, too, you will find the remains of the 8 Minutemen that were killed in the first volleys of the American Revolution on Lexington Green. Who were the words from? And it echoes what you all have been saying. It was from Reverend Jonas Clark, who was the chaplain of the Minutemen. And it comes from words that he said less than 4 hours after those shots, before the march from Concord back to Boston had even begun, as he was saying a short prayer service to the families of the slain Minutemen. They nobly dared to be free. If you think about it, we are putting together now a citizen's guide to the American Revolution in Loudoun County. It will be put out by the Virginia 250 Loudoun County Committee. And we were coming up with a list of the people we thought were the most important. Was it Francis Peyton Esquire, who lived along the Route 15 corridor of the largest states? He is the one that will preside over the meeting that issues the Loudoun Resolves in June of 1774. Or was it the man who regularly was preaching to over 500 people who came from the rural districts of Loudoun, even Germans going from here to hear him speak, the Reverend John Marks at Catoctin Church outside of Percival? It's interesting that one of the things we will have to wrestle with is, how did that consensus emerge? You and I know that if you were to go to 7th grade or 6th grade in 1960 something in junior high school, or as we call it, and were to ask what percentage were loyalists, what percentage were patriots, what percentage was sort of in that nebulous area in the middle. And if you were then to visit in the 70s and again in the 80s and the 90s and now and again, you know that those percentages would have changed every single time with the latest theory. But the question that we're wrestling with today is not only why did this happen, and we know there are key events involved, but how did this consensus occur? So it's something we want you to think about pretty intensely. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and we'll begin with Alicia, to make a final comment before we toss it to you. Whatever it is, based on all you've heard so far, you would like to say. We'll start with Alicia.
So, yeah. A little closer. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Right. So we've heard lots of things kind of going back and forth. And what I want you to be attuned to is this second revolution going on. by people who are of African descent, who are free and enslaved. They're listening. They don't have the strong voices that you hear at the table. Their voices are introspective because they have to be careful about where they live. There were some voices that were coming from a little girl in Boston. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley, and her voice was coming out through poetry. And what she did as she was maturing, she began to read newspapers and information to other people who were enslaved. So when you think about the fact, especially in the cities like Philadelphia, Boston, up and down the coast, most enslaved were very few in households. So they did not have close communities. They had to create communities so they would learn what was going on. Those also that were in rural areas were similar because during this period, we were talking about plantations of 5,000 enslaved or 500 on a plantation. We were talking about 3 or 4, 10 or 12, 25. So the communication might have been slow, but it happened. And so on their days off, when they had, I guess what we would consider informal churches, because there wouldn't be a church house, they would meet under a tree until they were able to meet a house. People were talking and they were lining up. Who's going to give us the best opportunity for freedom? And I think, as I remember joking about how Lord Dunmore probably was the first emancipator, when we talk about emancipation and we celebrate Juneteenth, but he probably was the first one. And so they had to make decisions. So through all of this, and they did. Some became patriots. Some were forced to become patriots because they were substituting for their owner or the owner's son. Some became loyalists. So even though there's this quiet hum going on, they're reading, they're thinking, they're planning, and they're resisting. And the Revolutionary War, or the talk of revolution, also gave them an opportunity to run. So some did run and ran to Canada or ran to wherever they could. And the, the revolution, not the revolution, the runaway ads began to pop up because during war or potential war, things are in disarray. And therefore, they took an opportunity, many of them, to run.
Just to add on to that, Alicia made a really good point about Dunmore being the first emancipator. Yeah, what Alicia's referring to and is evidence of this communication happening within enslaved communities is in November of 1775, we're fully in the war here. Lord Dunmore, in kind of an attempt to try and regain Virginia, because the British aren't sending in troops, they're too committed in places like Massachusetts, eventually in New York, he can't get the soldiers he needs, and so he issues a proclamation in November that is calling on any free white loyalists to join him, but also, and this is really groundbreaking for this moment, he calls upon enslaved people and free Black people who are living in households under rebel masters to flee those masters and join him in Norfolk, Virginia, in Hampton Roads, and they'll get their freedom if they surrender. And I think it's some 900. Is it 900? It's
The numbers are
the numbers are tough, but we do know at least hundreds of these Black people are making this very difficult choice, and that communication is happening within those households and those communities. And they're coming to that very difficult decision. Do I try to take my family and escape to an unknown future? Can I make it all the way to Norfolk? Will Dunmore actually give me the freedom once I get there? Or will we be captured by rebels. So I'm really glad you brought that up, and those conversations are happening. We have the evidence.
Yeah, and yet more evidence of this is it's not just limited to Dunmore's proclamation. That is something that Dunmore does as world governor, but it becomes kind of the unofficial, and in some cases, official policy for the British Army through the war. And so knowledge of this passes through those African-American communities. It's not just happening in Virginia. It's happening in New York. It's happening in New England. It's happening in the Carolinas that, they see soldiers in red coats. The assumption is that that is their ticket to freedom. And, this is not necessarily something that they're getting from written. I think a lot of it's word of mouth. It's passing through these communities. So it's yet more evidence of exactly what you're talking about.
Just as part of that same November 7th, 1775 proclamation indicated that quit rents should not be paid that Christmas. And that is the nebulous, the beginning of our next week's talk, next month's talk on the second Sunday of August, which will be taught by Ed and the director of the Farm Museum, Emery Jarelson. Let's go to Nancy.
I would not call Dunmore the great emancipator. If you were an enslaved person in a loyalist household, you were sent back to your master. If you joined Dunmore, unfortunately, I'm not blaming him for the smallpox. It wasn't necessarily much of his grouping was wiped out by smallpox because they were forced off the shore and they were in a ship and they got it and there wasn't much alternative to what they would do. But the future of, the point of can we trust that we will actually ultimately not be enslaved, it was a mixed bag, so to speak, as to whether they were actually permanently free. As was indicated, this was a tactical move on the part of the British. It was not people are fond of saying, for example, one of my favorite revelations when I was writing my book on this dealing with slavery was Oglethorpe, right? Because Georgia was the only colony that was established that banned slavery from the beginning. The only one, not Massachusetts. They said under certain conditions, Oglethorpe banned it. So, I thought that would have been great to be in the election campaign, but it never happened. But people always say, well, he didn't really mean it. He only meant that for this practical reason and that practical reason. Well, I don't believe that's true from other things I've read of all his letters, but let's turn that back. In this case, I would say Dunmore didn't really believe it. He was going for, as the British always did, toward us through the Civil War, where they backed the Confederacy, but claimed to be the big champions of the anti-slavery movement. It's been a strategic decision against a potential rival in the United States.
And I would say strategic, but you have to walk in the shoes of the people who were enslaved. Anything for them is better than what they are now. So, and remember Dunmore and all the colonists, everybody was British. Everybody was, who could you trust? Everybody, there was no, we call them African Americans. I try to say early African Americans. There was no American. They were not Americans. And so therefore to walk in, I have to think about what would I do? And in fact, Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, if you go into the website, they have an interesting challenge board. And they throw out concepts just like we threw out here. And question is, what would you do? If you were in those situations, what would you do? And so I think we have to I never thought, I didn't grow up even hearing about the Loyalists. I didn't hear about people going to Nova Scotia. And then when I went to Nova Scotia and I saw all these Black people, I said, how'd you get here? Where did you come from? You know, and then they said, the lower 48, at the lower 48. And I'm like, really? So, you know, walking in their shoes when you are enslaved, I can't even believe the brutality, what was going on. I have no idea in individual homes or farms. But if you have an opportunity to leave and go, you didn't know where you're going to go in any particular position, but what you knew is you were getting out. And so, you know, whoever might have been an emancipator and whoever, as the Patriots decided to stay with the colonists, they didn't know what they were getting into either. And in fact, those who became soldiers based on being a patriot, after their service, they were expected to return to their owner. And so they had to flee. So, you know, what did you get? Yes.
Building on that, of course, the recovering attorney and me, different colonies / states did honor those promises, depending upon the states. There was no uniform, so let's be careful with that. The other thing is just as the recovering teacher in the room, we're talking about recommending books and reading. I'm with Nancy 3000% on that. I recommend Simon Schama's book. I think it's called Perilous Voyage. Rough Crossing. It's okay. I go synonymous. I don't know. I should be president. But we end up with but that's for the complexity of what we're talking about here. The complexity of motives, of results, and the story of the 16,000 who were evacuated from New York City, you know, et cetera. So again, we have to be the missionaries of depth rather than whatever.
And now it's your turn. So, while we have no expectations, I am going to walk around and I'll get you to help me. I'll give you this one, I'll take that one, and if he'll take this side, I'll take this side, because we're gonna trip over wires otherwise. The whole one.
You're already lawyer. Yeah, you're already lawyer. But he's got to get his.
So if you would like to make a comment or chime in with something on this question of the coming of the revolution, what brought it on? We touched the surface, you know that. What do you think? What do you know? What have you read? Would someone like to? We'll pass the mic to you. We ask that you keep your comments reasonably efficient. About 4 inches.
Yeah, I just, a thought come to my mind about Benjamin Franklin's Portrait Almanac. I was wondering how that fit into this or was it well related to it. Portrait Almanac.
Anyone want to comment on that?
I think Nancy has some comments.
My comment's not on the almanac per se, but on his printing operation. He was involved in he ran newspapers, as you know, as well as the almanac, and he printed books, and he printed some very incendiary anti-slavery books in the 18th century. He also ran ads for runaway slaves in his newspaper. But he did play a very important role in an international coordination of the anti-slavery movement. He worked with this fellow called Benezet. I hate to plug my book, but a lot of it's in there. But the worked with this guy Benezet, and circulated his material. Was picked up in England, then it was picked up in France, he wrote articles about the interface between the economy and slavery, which I think is absolutely critical, that we had to get a manufacturing economy for our independence and growth, and slavery was antithetical to that. He did that in 1751. So he did a lot conceptually and as an organizer, which is really what Benjamin Franklin was, as well as a scientist and everything, and diplomat and everything else you can imagine.
Comments from you? Who would like to weigh in? Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Gary Higgins. I think the panel's done a great job. One of the things, and I don't tend to be a historian, although I've read history all my life, is that when you start digging into history on the surface level, as they study in school a lot, unfortunate, is you think these are monolithic movements where everybody did the same thing and joined the same thing and thinks the same thing, and it's just not true. When you dig into history and read firsthand contemporaneous accounts, everybody did what they did for different reasons. Now, they may have joined around a central issue, like you talked about, losing their freedom or their safety, but they all had different motives. And that's what I think we lose in history that's taught in schools, or whatever's taught in schools these days. And I appreciate Bill's comments. There's a lot of stuff being taught to young people today that is not good history, and it's unfortunate because it undermines our country's founding and the wonderful things that happened, and the fact that it was so unique because it's imperfect. Well, we're all imperfect. I got news for you, and that's unfortunate. But I think you guys do a great job. And one last comment that Nancy made: I don't think you can study this era of time without taking a deep dive into the Great Awakening. It was occurring contemporaneously with this. It was forming people's thought patterns and minds and religious beliefs, and it went on from 1730 to 1770, and it set this country on fire spiritually. So we can't look at this period without considering that as well. Thank you.
Yes.
This is good? Okay. Yeah, I think that as of particularly yesterday, it would be highly useful for a lot of people begin to read a lot about this country, particularly the original source material. And I'd like to ask you about one document. I don't know if people know about this document. It's a memoir that was written as a result of the 1824-25 trip that Lafayette made when he came back to the United States. He brought with him a man by the name of Auguste Levasseur. He talks about coming to Virginia and having conversations with people in Virginia about the history of the state. And here's something he writes. This is written after the trip. He says this: in about the year 1680, the General Assembly of the state of Virginia requested of the parent state, England, that it put an end to this commerce in human flesh, that is slavery, infamous and unnecessary in the future. It says, other colonies repeated this cry of justice and philanthropy, but the parent country was callous and responded only by this atrocious resolution of Parliament. The importation of slaves in America is too lucrative for the colonies to be able to insist that England renounce it forever. This response was accompanied by threats to which it was necessary to succumb, since they were in no condition to resist them. Nonetheless, the General Assembly renewed several times its demand. This would suggest that it will be interesting for us to look at original source material, or people who were writing right after the revolution, or for other reasons have, because this kind of thing is not generally available. People don't know about that kind of thing. That's the first thing. I just think it would be useful for people to stop reading glosses and go find things that may give a much different view. The second thing I just like to say is that while it's true that a lot of people didn't know why they were joining what became the American Revolution, who were African American. There were plenty of people who did. James Forten was 15 years old, captured and put on a ship right outside of Brooklyn, refused at the point that he was given the offer to go, because he became the playmate of the captain of the ship, to go to England. And he said, no, I'm a patriot of my country. And there's no way that I'm going to give up this cause. And he stayed on the slave ship. That's all that. Prince Hall, the head of the Free Africans in Boston, and his petitions. Right? That you knew what Crispus Attucks had been a runaway slave. He was first listed in 1750 as a runaway. He was 27 years old. And the next time we hear about him, he's there in 47 as part of the 5 people that get killed and all get buried in the same grave together near the Boston Common. So, as was said, a lot of people were doing a lot of things for a lot of different reasons, but let it not be said that people who were Africans and also free Black Africans who had been freed by the time of 1670, 1680s, people who worked for their freedom and have been free for decades in this country, grew up in places like Vermont and other places like Agrippa Hall and others. So it's a much more rich, interesting, and exciting history.
Anyone else like it before? I got you.
Hello, I'm Mike Zapp, and I'm a member of the Historical Society. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that, first of all, that the idea of the Declaration of Independence, and then following that, the revolution goes with it, is not unique. As the German philosopher Leibniz said, nothing takes place suddenly. Change passes through intermediate stages. And the intermediate stages are replete in history. I'll point out a few shortly. And that is in 1581, the 7 Dutch estates or provinces established a republic. They forswore their allegiance to the King of Spain, accused him of abandoning his part of the contract of being a prince. In fact, I'll give you his their language is, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislators. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. These are words that you will find also in the Declaration of Independence. In 1721, the Swedish estates started a coup, which basically ended absolutism in Sweden. The estates, the Riksdag, which was the Swedish parliament, consisted of nobles, the priests, clergy, the burgesses, or the urban middle class, and peasants. And they drew up a constitution, which is called the law of the realm. And that constitution allowed women to have limited suffrage. The king was still in power, but basically Parliament, the Riksdag, ruled the country. Now that lasted until 1772, when there was a coup by Gustav III, the king, and he reinstated absolutism in Sweden. Not all of these precedents end up happily. What I'm trying to get at is there's a broader picture about the American Revolution. There were ideas floating through the world at that time. We mentioned some in this discussion. The Industrial Revolution was just starting in the 1750s. The urbanization, and with urbanization, the whole social issue of the poor was also increasing in Europe, especially, but also here in America. There was an agrarian economy that was changing, and a way of life in Europe. A lot of the agrarian lands were being enclosed. Public education, we mentioned that. Financing, and with financing, the whole budget of the British Empire was in flux because of the wars that started with the Hanoverian dynasty, actually before that in the reign of Queen Anne, and ended up until the what we call French and Indian War. Paying for those wars was a big issue, and also part of that was renewing the military establishment. The British fleet in the 1770s was actually very old, and there was a huge debt there to be paid to renew the fleet. But these are things that influenced how Parliament was going to find resources to maintain the empire, but also and put the squeeze on the colonies, who they thought they were part of their protection. And that's all I have.
Thank you. I'm looking at our clock, and I think what we need to do now is have a restroom and refreshment break. It's a warm afternoon. Just across from the church here, you will see the parish hall, and we have a good spread for you. And we will reconvene at 4 o'clock promptly. We very much are going to want you to participate in the second question. And the way we've set up the second one is our panel will speak fairly briefly, and then we want to have a public discussion about how this 250 might best use the anniversary to do something productive. So we will see you in about 19 or 20 minutes. Restrooms, if you go into the hall, are at the back far end. You'll see 2 restrooms there. Thank you very much for your participation so far. We hope to see you back in a little while. Lincoln won on the eve of the Civil War, 1860, and now Democrats were eager for a comeback. Also, Confederates was the first election they could vote in for president in some time, and they were eager to get back. The cities were filled with new immigrants who wanted to vote, and in the end, once again, the same story. Mr. Tilden from New York State won the popular election, and the Electoral College, by a single vote, went to General Rutherford B. Hayes. Someone we knew here because he had fought in our region. And that just tore the nation apart. And yet at the same time, we will try to unify. The largest exposition that America had ever seen was held in Philadelphia, grand exposition. My great-grandmother's history book, which was published in 1876, She would have been 13 at the time in her final year back in the day when everybody went to high school. You finished in 8th grade. In her final year, she had that book, which she treasured for the rest of her life. The whole opening chapter was a grand exposition of that year of us celebrating the centennial of America's first civil revolution, the Declaration. If you jump ahead, some of you were well versed in what 1974, 5, 6 and on was like. Remember that we were coming through the end of the Vietnam War. We were coming through a massive generation gap. Those freaking hippies or whatever we were saying, or in many cases we were saying those old people. I remember I distinctly was so generation gap minded that my parents were called the old man and the old lady. And we were also coming through Watergate and the division that happened there. And yet we did things at that time that united us again. A wagon train across the country, the entry of majestic tall ships from around the world, the visits by the Queen of the United Kingdom. Remember her coming to visit President Gerald Ford? And then, of course, there were the things we did at the local level, including establishing the Lovettsville Historical Society, writing a new tome on the history of Lovettsville, creating a small museum in a butcher shop just behind the church here. It still exists. It's a little bigger and about to get a little bigger than that with this 250 celebration, cooperating with the town of Lovettsville. Our question then becomes, oh, aren't we divided? And what a day for the vision of the last 2 weeks. And think about what happened last night, or debates, or whatever, how divided we are. We were told on these 250 committees, you better be prepared for that. If you think this is going to be a celebration, guess again. Because there are a lot of people that are so annoyed, so angry, and feel like we have left them behind or ignored their past, that this is going to be divisive and you better be ready for it. It's fascinating reading the reports we were being given. Most of them date from 2018, 19, 20, 22. The state just put them back online this week, and all of the committee members were warned about this. Take a look at them. And you look at them, and all I can tell you is, oh my gosh, data must be current. It's irrelevant, because we are not in 2018, 19, or 20 at all, are we? It's 2024, and we're facing 25, 26, and trying to guess what's going to happen. The question I have is, as we look at the American Revolution, you obviously have some interest. You wouldn't have bothered to give up a Sunday afternoon come. How should we approach it? Should we celebrate, commemorate, all of the above? Should we investigate? Should we have community meetings to talk about where democracy is at this point? Should we have parades? What should we do? I do remember that the one thing we came up with last big commemoration of a controversial issue was Civil War, which we began and worked with for 8 years from 2008 to 16. One thing we realize is we should leave a legacy by our work. But as to what that ought to be, that's where we get confused. Our panelists have all agreed on one thing. They don't want to talk for long. They would really rather have this a great conversation. But because they're here to warm these seats, and we gave them free water, you know how much those 6 bottles cost? What's $1 maybe? At any rate, we would like to hear from them first, just as a way to crank us up. And then we're gonna, once again, pass the microphone around. So let me turn to our panel, and whoever like to begin can have the mic first. We only have one mic now, the battery died in the other one, and we'll just pass it up and down the line. Does anyone like to be the opener on this?
I don't have a whole lot to say, except that my strong view is that we should celebrate the American Revolution. I've started a series on my blog, AmericanSystemNow.com, to that effect. I believe that is because what we represent as a country. And the revolution is unique and essential for us to revive. The problem is that so many of our population doesn't understand the revolution in the same way. Some of it think of it, there's a big divide on this question of power. Is power in itself bad, which many of the revolutionaries were very devoted to from the English tradition. I remember reading the Cato letters, and they said, well, you know, the powers that be have created this South Sea bubble, and we have to devise new punishments to torture and kill them because they have made the whole country suffer. You know, power has to be destroyed. And then there are those, like the ones that I honor, who believe that power, and Alexander Hamilton being one, can and must be used for good, must be used to have a prosperous country that is involved for all. And I believe if people are educated, and they must be educated, that we should devote ourselves to educating and discussing the actual ideas and that went into the American Revolution, how they were implemented, how they weren't implemented, many failures, obviously, but I believe we'll come out with a very strong belief that it should be celebrated and understood by much more of our population.
So, you know, we've all heard that old saying that politics is local, and in my opinion, that applies just as equally to history. One of the best things to come out of the bicentennial, in my opinion, is this absolute explosion of local historical societies, local publications. I mean, I go down to the Balch Library, and half that library, those books were printed between 1976 and 1980. And I really would love to see that kind of recommitment to our local history and telling the local stories, visiting these local places, talking about the local who are involved in this, because I think that brings it down to a very human level that anyone can be inspired by. You know, we talked about the people in power, we talked about the average everyman, we talked about the lives of enslaved people and Native Americans. You know, that's a history that we can all kind of tap into emotionally and find the inspiration that these same people did 250 years ago. I mean, I'm being way too optimistic here, but I think that the way to win over people's hearts and minds is to bring it to a level that they can identify with personally. You know, I don't know. And maybe I've been spending too much time with Rich because I think that was a very rich answer. So.
Should I hear what we were talking about before the audience arrived? Sure. Okay, sure. We were having such a nice little chat up here in the deacons' pews that I don't know if they have deacons in this church or not, I'm sure. Anyway, I'm a Catholic, lost in the church. But we end up with, we were talking and the suggestion was made that I pass this along later on. I spent last fall, I covered, as a retired teacher, I covered for a teacher going out on family leave with a new baby in the family. I was at Potomac Falls High School from October through Christmas break. And I noticed very obviously that so many of my students for Northern Virginia Community College's dual enrollment class at Potomac Falls were from all over the world. And the overwhelming thing that really I liked was that they thrived on the class because they honestly want to know what it means now that our families have chosen to be Americans. Now we have a serious number of people in Loudoun County from other countries who are diplomatic. They're here, they'll be going. We have others who are here under the specialized work visas. They're going home to the home office, wherever they're from back home in other countries. But we do have thousands of families that are here. And I'm sure Richard and the other teachers in the crowd will agree that one of the nice ways to educate the moms and dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and many of these households are multi-generational households, is to deal with the youngsters in the school, which is why one of the things that I'm hoping in a concrete way, I'm on the board, honored to be on the board of the Lovettsville Museum, a mighty supporter of what these guys do with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area and schools and the young people, is that's really where I think a major payoff can be, is working with those young people and to elevate the knowledge of these young teachers who have come from some very superficial history classes as they got their education degrees. And so I'll be very pleased to be participating in a meeting where we're trying to, many of us from the different historical sites and organizations are trying to help backstop LCPS and their very high quality Director of Social Studies, Mrs. Daniel Graham, in raising the professional development and so that it can get to the teachers, as well as encourage the good things of the museum and VPHA and other groups. So I think we've got our work cut out for us. But with autocracy on the move around the world, when you've got Orban as the presiding officer of the European Union, I mean, we've got people around the world who need the lesson of limited government and a republic and a democracy, because it's not a slam dunk anymore. This isn't 1949 George Marshall's work. Sad.
All right, so I was thinking of a couple of things. One, of course, I've always had this conflict between celebrate or commemoration. And so I'm going to go with the definition of them because they're different. And I go with commemorate. And I can do that because the more you know about the participation of the various people who participated in the war, being in, or the revolutionary period, be it as a loyalist or a patriot. I'm sorry, it's kind of going on. I can respect their decision on others. What I'd like to do as a closing, or how should we mark this commemoration, is I would say by learning, that you should continuously learn. So if you learned about the Revolutionary War when you're in high school, then take a look at it again, because that's the reason for commemorations, is to bring it up again. It's to remind you. And so as a result of that, realize that a lot of scholars and historians have written new books. Now, they may not all agree with what you think, but you can choose, you can read, you can stop reading if you like, keep your receipt, you can take it back to the bookstore. But at any rate, take a look at it so you can take a little deeper dive on what was going on during that period. My other thought that I have is learning from a diverse set of resources. So I had just mentioned books. So books are a possibility. Lots of people read books. You still can read 1619. I've got another book, which is Black Patriots and Loyalists. That's a book. There's a book on African Americans. It's very heavy. And it's an easy read. They were good soldiers. And the reason I like it is because if you didn't come from Virginia, then you can go to your state and find out who the people were that served. They won't be the older ones, because I've looked up people and they're not always in here. But if you're from Massachusetts, you're from South Carolina, you're from what West Virginia didn't exist. But if you are from other places, you can find, or where was your grandfather from? You know, you can look up, persons during that time. And I have to go back with, what Travis said and identify where you fit in. Where do you fit in? I was thinking of that myself when I looked at my, family tree. And I said, let me see how many people in my family tree lived during that period. And this would be on the two grandparents and my father's side. So I came up with 10 lived during that period. That's because on one tree, those people were free at that time. The other is because of my white ancestry. And so therefore, because of white ancestry, I've got at least 5. So even though they're my ancestors, I didn't know them, but I still can identify, we're still related. So I think being able to identify with the period and people who lived in the period is something you can think about. You can challenge yourself. Look at the census, see if you were around, and if you had family on the 1790 census, you can extrapolate that and figure that parents were born in 1770, and therefore they probably were living during the Revolutionary War. The other, in terms of diversity, learning or resources, there is a documentary, which is produced by the History Channel. So if you have a History Channel, this documentary is on that. It's called Black Patriots and Heroes. It also talks about the Loyalists. And if you don't have the History Channel and you have a Loudon library card, you can go to their film section, which is called Canopy, and just put in Black Patriots. It'll come up. You know, you have to go in and log in and all that, but you know, it will come up. It's only about 40 minutes long. If you're a listener or you're on your treadmill or you're walking around the neighborhood and you like to listen to podcasts, then I'm like a rabid fan of Ben Franklin's World. And I love it. It comes out of William and Mary and the Omahandra Institute. It talks about everything in early America, everything. African Americans, Native Americans, Jewish people, Irish people, everything, anything you think of, education, how did women live and work during the colonial period? I mean, you name it, they've got it. And when you key into one presentation on the podcast, at the end of the podcast, they list related podcasts. So if you zero in on women in the colonial period, then next they'll talk about how childbirth happened at that time. Education of women. They just, you could go down a rabbit hole and never come back. So that I like. And then the final thing would be museums. We have museums within 2 or 3 hours of us that are related to the American Revolution. That is the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. You don't even have to drive. You can take the train or the bus and let you off right in the middle. Then I've not been to that, and they have excellent exhibits, and also they're online. And then the last one, I have not been to the Yorktown Museum, but they have, I think it's like the Yorktown Museum of Battle or something.
It's the American Revolution in Yorktown.
Oh, okay, I'm dying to get to that, but, so what I'm trying to say is in your learning, depending on how you like to learn, there are different ways between books, podcasts, documentaries, and walking into a museum and taking advantage of the information that's there. So, I just wanted to throw that out to you. Oh, one last thing, I have extras, but this was, a pamphlet that was done, and I'm not mentioning any names, because she's like shy. But anyway, in this brochure is, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was African-American, Daniel Coleman, and I think one of the gentlemen in the back who's not here right now, who was talking about original documents and how you can go to the courthouse. You can see, it's very difficult to read, but you can see his pension, his application for pension in the courthouse. So, is at the top of this. I have extras if anyone would like.
Yeah, for me, when we're looking at how to best commemorate the 250th, it's simple to just go back and look at past commemorations. Rich kind of opened this talk this afternoon with a look at some of the past commemorations. When we look at the first one in 1825, Lafayette's return to the United States is really kind of the first time that veterans of this war are actually getting some recognition for what they did. In my opinion, too little, too late. I mean, these guys are elderly, and many of them have already died, and it's only after this that a lot of them start to get their pensions. So, kind of off the bat, we're looking at some people who had been forgotten and are now starting to get some recognition. And then when we move on to the Centennial in 1876, this is a huge World's Fair in Philadelphia, right? It's all centered mostly in Philadelphia, obviously, because of its revolutionary activity. And they're focusing a lot on the agricultural pursuits, the manufacturing, horticultural education, and kind of showing the world just how far we've come. But there's a really great moment during the fair where representatives from the National Women's Suffrage Association, they had applied to talk at this fair and were denied, basically saying, this doesn't have anything to do with the Centennial, and sorry, we just don't have time for you. And so they burst through the doors at the end of a reading of the Declaration, marched right up to the front, and essentially delivered a Declaration of the Rights of Women, signed by Elizabeth Cady Stanley, Susan B. Anthony, all these leading suffragists at the time. And I really like to do that kind of as a look of what should we do in the future. We should look at these past commemorations and see who we left out. Look at those stories that were not told in those past commemorations, and how can we make this story better encompass our whole society and those who came before, and also as a way to take stock as to where we are as a society now. How far have we come in creating this more perfect union, and how can we use this commemoration to move forward? How can we use this to make our society better?
So I love that every single one of us, the common thread was that we have a lot of work to do. And we are absolutely blessed. I'd be very remiss if we didn't mention this. Our 250th committee here in Loudoun County, I cannot think of a finer group of people to be leading the way on this. I mean, the representatives from our different heritage organizations, local government, the museum community, the genealogical societies. We really have the best group that I can possibly imagine to do this hard work. So consider this my opportunity to thank those who are involved in this, and everyone on this panel is involved in this committee. We've got a lot of work to do, but we've got a team to do it.
One message seems to come across from the panel before we turn it over to you. What we are as America is something that is subtle and takes learning. You know, we are always learning, our whole lives we are learning. And to define the commonality of all Americans in divisive times is quite an important task. Obviously, passing the past along is a way of looking at the present. We all have a job to do. Children, yes. New residents, yes. Old residents, and of course, ourselves. But if there was some agreement, I think, in the panelists that yes, we'd celebrate, but a commemoration goes beyond that into being reflective. And it was very interesting, just last week, here at this church, we did it down at the historic Alden Mill, we did it in Middleburg. And what it was a simple thing. We're going to publicly read the Declaration of Independence to listen to it. Here we listen to it in English and German because it's the German settlement. That's reflection. And we have to hope we can do it. What are your thoughts as to what might be good to tackle? And I'll walk the mic around. The wires are gone, so I can go down right down the middle. And be happy to hear from anyone who would like to comment. Please don't be afraid to. We've all made fools of ourselves. So your turn now. Yeah. Yes.
I'll open with my opinion that this should be a full-on celebration. We celebrate birthdays, we commemorate other things, and this is the birth of our nation. Our nation isn't perfect, we've got lots of work to do. But I don't think, like in your family, you should hang your F's on the refrigerator, you hang your A's on the refrigerator, and you work at improving the things that weren't good. You know, anybody that has traveled to a third world country or even into central Mexico knows for a fact that this is the best country in the nation. I mean, in the world. There is no place like it. You can complain about what's not right here. Take a ride through the Yucatan Peninsula and take a look at what that looks like right here. And that's why we have, they argue whether it's 7 million or 11 million people coming over our border in the last 3 or 4 years. They didn't come here because they think it's a bad place. They came here because it's the last hope on the planet. And we can talk about European democracies, but if it wasn't for this democracy, there wouldn't be any European democracies or republics. And so I think that it needs to be a celebration. It needs to dwell on the great things that we've done. We need to be mindful of the things that we haven't done so well and work at improving them. But you know, that's just where I'm coming from, and I think that's where we should all be coming from. And those, and you know, I'll get down into what here that's in my own family. I'm Irish, okay? Irish hate the English. The Irish have been subjugated by the English for 450 years. Go back and study Cromwell's conquering of Ireland. They brought 500,000 Irish people to this country. It was a people country. And those people were not slaves, but they were indentured servants. And you know how hard it was to keep somebody indentured as an indentured servant? Not hard. The Irish were so angry at the English that they declared neutrality against the Nazis in World War II. My father, who was 100% Irish, when he found out, when he was in Europe and he knew about that, he had nothing good to say about the Irish. And so the Irish Civil War was in the 1920s. That's what, 100 years ago? They didn't settle with the IRA until 1998. And, you know, it needs to stop being about this group against that group in the wrongs of the past. It needs to be building on the good things and building on the future. And so I want to see a celebration, and anything that I participate in will be a celebration.
And just as a word, if you are from Lovettsville, Loudoun County, Fauquier County, this is Delegate and member of the General Assembly, and Gary Higgins has been serving Loudoun County for a long time. So his observations come from a lot of dealing with Loudon and its many divisions. Thank you, Gary, for coming today. Who else would like to speak? I've still got a mic here that works. Yes, there you go. About 4 inches from your mouth. Yes.
Is this okay? Yeah. Well, one thing that I heard through all the panel is we need to educate. We need to teach the young people what has not been taught. We have to remind the older people what had happened. You asked the question, what shall we do? In my opinion, to start educating, yes, we need to go to books. Yes, we need to go to podcasts. But unfortunately, our youth doesn't go there. If you are involved with the schools, the young people go to video games, to the movie, to the theater. So I would suggest that since it's something nationwide, something that has to be educated or reintroduced to the whole nation. Why we don't talk about the people who design video games? Why we don't talk with people who make movies in Hollywood? You know, the theater has such an impact. Many people didn't know anything about Titanic until the Titanic show came and won an award. So if we want to get to the masses, and I mean, here, most of you, and don't include myself, I'm just came as a attachment. You are scholars, you read, you know, you want to do all this. But what we can do for the people who are not, how could we get to them? How many under 20 watch the History Channel? But I can tell you that many under 30 play a video game every day. So, yes, sounds crazy probably, but we are in the 21st century, and in my opinion, we should get to the people the way they are used to communicate. Before was the newspapers and the letters. Now we have Instagram, we have WhatsApp, we have things that are really quick, goes viral, what they say. YouTube, I think maybe capsules, maybe little information, with true information to something that they can read about it, listen about it, get connected to it. I think that will be a better way to get to the masses. My idea in the beginning was, let's do a little pamphlet and distribute in the schools. And the kids can color in the books and read a little bit about it. But I think at this time, most of the kids will not even look at the book. So it's my opinion. I don't know if that will work or not. It's a suggestion.
Just want to say one thing on that. As an example, take the Hamilton musical. Hamilton musical. Its most valuable contribution was that it sent people of all ages scurrying to the libraries to read about Alexander Hamilton or to read primary documents. So that is, so I don't think you can, I agree that you need books, right, to get people interested. And there is, as all of us know, we're in Williamsburg, a national film being produced on the American Revolution, which is supposed to rival the Ken Burns, Civil War series, which will probably have a major impact in terms of popular culture. Right? But I think that you can't skip the next step, that this inspires people to do what our greatest statesmen did, which is educate themselves. That's what Frederick Douglass did. That's what Abraham Lincoln did. That's what they were passionate about because they knew that their country needed them to educate. They needed it for their own self-improvement. They needed it for the improvement of the country. And I think that if we have the right kind of mass media entree point, we can inspire that, but we can't do without them.
Just as an observation, in one of the great market economies of the world, which we are, just remember them possibilities could translate into dollars for somebody. And it always seems to motivate somebody in America to do something that therefore will reach the general public. So if we're looking at this now and thinking, oh Lord, we've got so far to go, and here we are already in 2024, and it's coming blasting down the road. As a young fellow, I used to work for the town of Lexington, Massachusetts, as an appointed guide of visitors from around the world. And I remember writing an editorial to the local newspaper in 1968, suggesting that this thing is coming blasting at us in 7 years and we're not even remotely ready. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, we're never going to be ready. But we were. And one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. In other words, do not be faint of heart here. But that said, we have a minute or two more. If any of you would like to observe, comment, I'll be happy to pass the mic to you. Normally, as those of you who've been here before know, rather than charge admission to these events, we pass the hat. We were a little bit delinquent doing that today. But on your way out, you will pass a cash drawer in the foyer, and you can put your 10s and 20s and 50s or whatever. Loose change, you know. Well, we'll accept them. We'll accept them. I know what that's at this point in time. Any? Yes. About 4 inches from the mouth works best for this time.
Just a couple things I thought it was interesting, your opening comments. A little bit, okay, your opening comments of the previous commemoration celebrations of the anniversary of our revolution, the Lafayette tour, and then following crisis, this is crisis setting when this crisis began, with the Hayes election, and so on, and how each of these will resolve some issues, but really pull the country together. And I think in this case, we can take a page from Frederick Douglass. We recently had occasion to read the entirety of his July 4th speech. What is the American Revolution to the Negro, or to the slave? And usually only part of the speech is the part where he kind of denounces slavery, and what is often omitted, and of course the speech is 14 pages, and even when you go to Google it, you only get kind of negative things that he said, and not really what he was emphasizing concerning the courage, the integrity of the founding fathers as a whole, and particular individuals which stood out. And I think as someone said recently, their words is immortalized in the Declaration, and the Constitution proceeded in many cases their actions. But this is not the centennial, but the World's Fair that in 1893, when Douglas at that point was the ambassador to Haiti, and the plan was to have the Negro Pavilion, where you were going to have people essentially minstrel shows and people, eating, watermelon eating contests, and so on. And Douglas came in and he completely judoed it with the Haitian Pavilion. So he was there, and he and Ida B. Wells gave extraordinary speeches about the actual contributions, historical contributions of Black Americans, but he also made in the pavilion, he had his grandson who was a professional violinist, James Douglas. In fact, there was Joseph Douglas, and he had Lawrence Dunbar, I think Will Marion there, and others who were all there. They played classical music, they recited poetry, and so on. And it was a celebration in terms of the integral part. And I think this is really true. This is what makes us America. The integral part that Black Americans, and as people have cited here, German Americans, Haitian Americans, Irish Americans, Native Americans have played since the inception and before the inception of this nation. I think this is beautifully captured, not to go on too far afoot on a tangent, but in the Loitza painting of the Washington crossing of the Delaware that has every nationality in it, including steering the boat, piloting the boat, one of Colonel Glover's Marblehead fishermen, a Black man who's at that point kind of in charge of the boat, together with his colleague. So we're all in one boat, and we have been. And I think what we can really do with this 250th anniversary, and we're here visiting, myself, my husband, my friend, the Spanishes, who we've known for years. So we're actually in New York, New Jersey, where we're going to be trying to do some things. But I think spreading these ideas across the country in terms of, I don't even want to use the term inclusive. So many of our terms have been really degraded, I would say, but that the concept is universal. The Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, these are universal ideas. America is not simply a place, it's a universal idea. And the fact that we have become so much less than that today makes it even more imperative and urgent that we celebrate, we remind, we restore, we educate people on these ideas, and we get back to this notion of what we all are as Americans. We bring America back to these principles which have been largely buried, but can be dug up, can be revived. So I think this is really should be the intent, is the promise, and is the hope for what we can do as we enter this period of celebration of our nation's birth.
If you did not live in New York, I would ask you to be on our committee right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, here we are at just about the end of things. I want to thank our panel, Nancy Spanis, Travis Shaw, Ian McDougall, Alicia Cohen, and Bill Wilkin. I'd like to thank the Lovettsville Historical Society for sponsoring this, allowing the Commission for endorsing it, St. James United Church of Christ for hosting us, and then now, as always, I turn things over to our Master of Ceremonies for a few final words about what's in the pipeline.